All right, so Joe Biden ran his 2020 campaign against Donald Trump, trying to differentiate himself on the issue of climate change, right? This was a guy who said he was going to take on the fossil fuel industry. He was going to aggressively transition us to renewable energy. Now, obviously, none of that turned out to be true, and it shouldn't be really too surprising to hear the types of stories that we are about to get into today, understanding the history of Joe Biden's entire career, whether it's in the Senate or under the Obama administration. This is not a guy who was ever going to be willing to take on the fossil fuel industry, okay? And just a reminder, these are the types of people who he was putting in his administration. One of the first people he nominated as one of his senior advisors was this motherfucker, Cedric Richmond, who literally presided over the single worst polluted district in the entire country and also was the top Democratic oil and gas PAC money recipient, okay? This is who he decides to advise him on climate legislation, all right? So clearly not going to be the type of guy who's willing to take on the fossil fuel industry in any serious way. On top of that, we are also coming off the heels of this completely objectively failed COP26 summit, which I told you guys was basically just this get-together of global leaders who get together and pretend to care about climate change and pretend and virtue signal about solving climate change while they do absolutely nothing to actually do that. And so we have resulted in this story, okay? And again, shouldn't be too surprising understanding who Joe Biden is, but coming on the heels of that completely failed COP26 summit where they were supposed to be talking about, saving the future habitability of the planet and all that junk, coming off the heels of that failed COP26 summit, Joe Biden is deciding to come home basically and make the situation even worse by doing shit like this. So here from Truth Out, Biden administration will hold US's largest offshore drilling auction days after COP26, the largest one in history. So let's go ahead and read some of the details here. So the Joe Biden administration is preparing to auction off more than 80 million acres of the Gulf of Mexico to oil and gas drilling companies less than a week after the United Nations COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland, where global negotiations over plans to reduce fossil fuel emissions faced an official deadline on Friday, and that deadline has obviously passed by this point. This was from November 12th. We are now November 15th. And so, yeah, the plans that they actually set out were completely pathetic, not even close to being enough. But they continue here saying that the annual Gulf of Mexico lease sale planned for November 17th in New Orleans is the largest federal offshore drilling auction in the United States history and comes just months after Hurricane Ida unleashed dozens of oil spills and petrochemical leaks from aging fossil fuel infrastructure near the Louisiana coast. And on October 1st, a ruptured underwater pipeline off the coast of California spilled an estimated 25,000 gallons of crude oil across ocean waters and beaches, the latest disaster to raise fears about the dangers of offshore drilling, okay? We've seen these oil spills a million times over, okay? This is not a unique occurrence. This type of shit happens all the time. And so Joe Biden, instead of, fixing a lot of our older oil pipelines that we have, he is still trying to expand, construct new oil pipelines like the Line 3 that he refuses to stop, even though it is basically going to be one of the dirtiest oil pipelines in the United States. It plows straight through indigenous lands and will inevitably have some oil spills like the ones that we had just read about just there. But again, it's not unusual, and Joe Biden is choosing to expand this offshore drilling problem instead of tampering it down or cutting back on it. But they continue here saying that more than 250 environmental, social justice, and indigenous groups sent a letter to President Joe Biden on Wednesday with an urgent plea to cancel the lease sale as the U.S. and other major polluters hammer out their latest pledges at the climate conference. And fossil fuels produced in the Gulf would contribute to global greenhouse gas emissions driving the climate crisis, obviously, and feed onshore refineries and petrochemical plants that pollute low-income communities and neighborhoods of color, specifically neighborhoods like the ones that are led or formerly led by this motherfucker, Cedric Richmond, again, who presided over a district that literally had an area within it that was called Cancer Alley because of how polluted it was due to a lot of these like petrochemical plants, etc. So again, he's choosing to expand on the worst problems that exist within the United States right now. And again, this is a guy who literally campaigned on a pledge to ban new oil and gas leases on public lands and ocean waters. President Joe Biden, though, in January issued an executive order that was placing a moratorium on these new federal leases while his administration conducts an environmental review, whatever that means, that has yet to materialize months after. And the moratorium was expected to have little immediate impact on drilling companies, which have already secured leases and permits to drill on public lands and waters for years to come. But still, Louisiana and a dozen other fossil fuel producing states filed suit, and in June, a federal judge blocked this pause that Biden had put in place. So Biden did put a federal pause on these leases, even though it's going to have very little immediate impact, as they were just saying. But he did put a pause on there, and then a federal Trump-appointed judge blocked that pause basically and resumed these. But there's still shit that Joe Biden can do to make sure that this doesn't happen. Okay, and it was pointed out here exactly what he could do by Christian Monsell, an Ocean's defense attorney at the Center for Biological Diversity, and she says that the court order blocking Biden's moratorium on new leasing does not compel offshore regulators to hold the lease sale for the Gulf of Mexico, and at the very least, regulators could postpone the offshore drilling auction and update the environmental impact review that advocates have challenged in court, according to a brief the groups filed with the Interior Department. And they say, quote, "The administration has more than sufficient authority under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to cancel this lease sale." Monsell said it's incredibly disappointing to see them not doing so and instead casting their lot with the fossil fuel industry and worsening the climate emergency. Okay, so again, Joe Biden, even though he did put that pause in place, and good for him for doing that, even though that's the bare minimum, right? But even though he did that, it was blocked by a federal judge, and they basically just threw their hands up and gave up the fight on this. Okay, instead of actually using the full authority that they have, as they were just explaining there that he could and does have the authority to act on. So he's not doing everything that he could, but again, not surprising coming from a guy like Joe Biden, who is pretty much completely bought and controlled by the fossil fuel industry. But again, just to give you a perspective in terms of where we are at in the climate crisis, okay, this COP26 summit should have been a wake-up call. Was it? I guess we'll have to find out on that. I mean, honestly, with the Build Back Better plan looking like it's completely dead and the bipartisan infrastructure framework that they just passed through the House being a net negative on climate change, it seems like, we have nothing good in the news to look forward to on climate change. And even with, Joe Biden's campaign pledges to get back into the Paris Climate Accords and become a global leader on climate change, okay, even if we were to stick to the pledges that were within the Paris Climate Accords, that would not in and of itself be enough. When Obama got us into the Paris Climate Accords, the whole purpose of that was like, this is a first step, right? This is a first step towards further action, right? And it wasn't enough back then, it wasn't enough now, and still, none of the countries, basically, except for one country, so only one country in the world is living up to the Paris Accord to curb global warming. So basically, Joe Biden's pledge to get us back in the Paris Accord and do all these, minor tweaks around the edges to the system to push us towards renewable energy, basically, is not even close to enough, right? Even if we were to fully abide by what was in the Paris Climate Accords, that in and of itself would not be enough, and we are not even close to meeting those bare minimum goals that were put in the Paris Climate Accords. So, the Joe Biden administration, unsurprisingly, is acting on behalf of the fossil fuel industry, and, you got guys like Joe Manchin who are millionaire coal barons who are basically completely sabotaging every piece of climate legislation that was in the Joe Biden agenda, which, again, reminder, the Joe Biden agenda, it originally got a grade of an F from the Sunrise Movement, just to give you a perspective in terms of how pathetic his agenda actually was on climate change. So in and of itself, Biden's agenda doesn't go nearly far enough, and on top of that, he is allowing it to be completely gutted and watered down by a millionaire coal baron from West Virginia, and on top of that, this COP26 summit proved that the United States is no leader on climate change, and honestly, we don't really have any global leaders on climate change. No countries around the world are taking this seriously enough, and we got a pretty bleak future ahead of us in dealing with the consequences that are inevitably going to come.